Imagine for a moment that you are responsible for the development of another person. Maybe you're a parent or caregiver, or maybe you're a manager or a business owner, and you don't have to imagine because you're responsible for the development of lots of other people. But today we want to consider how development happens. So imagine for a moment that you're responsible to develop someone who wants to learn a musical instrument. They want to learn to play piano or the violin. What would you do? Well, unless you know how to do that yourself, you're most likely going to find someone who can provide lessons that you're going to sign this person up for. You're going to find an expert who can provide that development for you. Same thing's true with, an athletic development. Let's say the person you're responsible to develop wants to learn how to skate or dribble a basketball. And again, unless you're an expert yourself, you're going to find someone who offers, sessions or a clinic or a camp or something where you're going to send that person to so that the expert can provide that development. So often that's how development in our world happens, isn't it? That experts provide that development, and so we look to experts to do that providing. So now let's consider if you were responsible for someone's spiritual development, their faith formation and how they understand and follow Jesus. Now what do you do? Similarly, as if you were getting someone to develop in their math skills or acting or music or sports, and would you look to experts to try to send them or sign them up to programs and experiences of those experts? Or is there a different way? See, what I want us to concentrate on this morning is a paradigm-changing view for how development happens spiritually, for how faith formation works, particularly in the next generation of children and developing young adults. Because the reality is that faith formation happens very differently than all kinds of other development in our world, where typically we look to experts to provide it. Faith formation happens in a completely different way. For starters, the data tells us this. We may assume that we can develop people spiritually by signing them up for programs and experiences that quote unquote experts provide. But a number of years ago, George Barna and his research team conducted a survey where they discovered the single most significant influences, particularly on kids and developing young adults, by the time they'd reached adulthood, the single most significant spiritual influences. And you might think that those were the church or, kids pastors or youth pastors or even summer camps. But statistically, those influences paled in comparison to the two most primary influences that were moms and dads. And even after those primary influences, the next most significant influences were people like grandparents and even aunts and uncles. And when it came to the church, this presumed source of spiritual development and influence, the single most statistically influential person was actually the lead or senior pastor, not the kids or youth ministry. That was quite a ways down the list. And statistically, what was revealed was that faith formation and significant spiritual influence actually happens very differently than any other kind of development in our world, because faith formation is more significantly stimulated in the day-to-day, everyday of people's homes. That when it comes to faith formation, faith is something that is homegrown. Now, this only validates what we see in the scriptures as God's intent for people of faith, really for all time. If we look way back in the early Old Testament, as God was rescuing his special people, the nation of Israel, from Egyptian slavery and leading them through the wilderness into this land called Canaan that he promised to give them. There's a time in that zone where Moses is about to introduce the 10 Commandments to Israel. He's about to give the nation of Israel the 10 commandments. And he begins by introducing them this way in Deuteronomy chapter 6. If you brought a Bible or you have a Bible app on your personal device, you can turn there because we're going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 6 today, beginning in verse 1, where Moses says, "These are the commands, the decrees and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you're crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you." There's a couple key things to observe in this opening section of this introduction to the 10 Commandments. The first is to appreciate the group that Moses is addressing. Because Moses isn't addressing the nation of Israel, organized in like neighborhoods or postal codes geographically, or even in like departments like we would in a company organizationally. Moses is addressing the nation of Israel under the identity of families, as tribes subdivided by their family units. Moses is addressing a group of families in introducing the 10 Commandments to them. And in addressing them as families, he's providing these 10 Commandments to them for their families to carry on the legacy of faith, it says, in their children and their children's children. From Moses' perspective, even by structure, he intends for this to be something that they receive as families for families, that this would be something that would be homegrown within them. He then goes on to kind of summarize and encapsulate what faith most fundamentally is. He says in verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." If you've heard that before, it's because in the New Testament, Jesus quotes these very verses when pressed by the religious establishment of his day to boil down all 613 Jewish laws down to one. And he quotes this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6 to describe what the essence of faith is all about, the singularity of the primacy of what we call Jesus' law of love, love for God and love for people. Moses encapsulates the essence of what these 10 Commandments and what a life of faith is going to be about. It's going to be about this experience of loving God and loving others with everything you've got. And so Moses goes on to describe how that will get developed as these families for these families. He concludes in verse 6. He says, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts." He says, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. He says, write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Because the essence of faith, represented or summarized by the 10 Commandments, is most encapsulated by the primacy of this law of love, Moses says this is something to be impressed on your hearts. And he says, as it's impressed on your hearts, it can be embedded and then impressed to be expressed in those around you, particularly in this case, to the next generation and generations to come, if you will allow it to be absorbed and embedded and expressed through your heart in the day-to-day of your everyday in your homes. Moses talks about all the kinds of things that they can do to remind themselves at their home that this is something that happens in the moment by moment, every day of life, in the living dynamics up close and personal in people's homes. Because in preparation for giving them the 10 Commandments, Moses appreciates that faith ultimately defined by the primacy of God's law of love, faith is something that is fundamentally homegrown. I hope that we can appreciate, as we absorb Deuteronomy chapter 6, why faith development is so fundamentally different than any other kind of development, and by definition, any other approach to development in our world. Because faith, by definition, is something that is fundamentally different. You can develop reading, writing, and arithmetic by looking to the experts to provide it, by taking courses and sending people to sessions and things like that. And you can do that when it comes to, learning musical instruments or how to sing or athletic development, learning how to do karate. You can do all those kinds of things by looking to the experts for what they provide. But because faith is fundamentally different, it's something that expresses itself in love and is to be embedded in your heart, faith requires a different sort of development. The kind of embodying that happens in the up close and personal of the everyday of our ordinary lives, where faith is more fundamentally homegrown. I was thinking about this contrast in how development happens when I was thinking recently about the best distance runner that the Niagara region has ever produced, a guy by the name of Mo Ahmed. If you don't know Mo's story, Mo is the Olympic silver medalist in the 5,000 meters, and he and his family moved to Canada when Mo was somewhere around 11 years old. And so early on in their time here in Niagara, his family presumably wanted to help Mo develop in his athletics, and so what did they do? Well, they signed him up with some experts, and Mo joined a local track club called the Niagara Olympic Club, and there, one of the coaches, Sharon Stewart, and her other coaches helped Mo develop, as did his high school coach at St. Catharines Collegiate, a guy by the name of Alex Och. His family kind of looked to the experts for the development that they could provide. And that continued in Mo's life. When he went to college, went to the University of Wisconsin, the coaches there, as the experts, provided development for Mo. And that continues on today in the professional track club that he's a part of in Oregon, where experts provide development for Mo. And Mo shows up and participates in the sessions and the workouts and the training environments that they facilitate in order for the experts to provide that development. But what's interesting is to consider where Mo's Muslim faith came from and how that was developed. Because when Mo talks about his Muslim faith, he'll attribute that to his parents and to his family, that was something that was nurtured in his home. And in an interview with Sportsnet, he kind of alludes to why or how that is when he said this. He said, being a runner is something that I do. A Muslim is what I am. A Canadian is what I am. A Somali is what I am. Do you see the fundamental difference in how these different dynamics develop? Typically, we approach development by looking to the experts and what they can provide because we're trying to develop skills or attributes. We're trying to develop something that people need to learn to do. Jesus invites people to follow him and to become more like him in nature, in character. That's what faith is. Faith is a worldview. Faith is a value system. And ultimately with Jesus, it's a heart attitude of love to be embedded and then expressed in and through our hearts. And because it's way more about being than doing, it requires a totally different approach to development. That's why faith, differentiated from all kinds of other development, needs to be fundamentally homegrown, because the home environment is where being is most developed, as opposed to sending someone to programs and events and activities provided by experts, which develops their doing. Now, if you're a parent, particularly of kids or developing young adults, and wondering why you've never heard this before, you may even be feeling a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe even a bit betrayed, because you may have actually heard the contrary taught before in a church environment. And so as we adopt this new paradigm of how faith formation happens, we may be wondering what the role of the church is, because we assumed that the church, like everything else, was supposed to be those experts that provided the development on our kids' behalf. And in his book, Faith Begins at Home, which I would encourage you, if you're a parent or a caregiver, to get throughout this series, pastor and author Mark Holman kind of describes why. He says the more prevalent reason why parents have passed to the church the responsibility of teaching their children faith is because the church has enabled them to do so. The church has enabled them to do so. He says in the 1960s and 1970s, the church saw an explosion in Christian education through Sunday school and youth group ministries. Churches added education wings and youth rooms to their facilities. At the same time, society entered into the technology age and families began to get busier. Work schedules increased and more moms started working. He said when the church began offering ministries for children and teenagers, parents welcomed the opportunity to bring their kids to church for a time of Christian education and fun. Quite honestly, for many parents, this provided a needed break from their children. While everyone's intentions were good, many parents started to see that these programs were an opportunity to pass on the faith nurturing responsibilities to the church. Parents dropped their kids off and said, "Here you go, teach my children faith. I'll be back in an hour to pick them up." Of course, the church never intended for these programs to take the place of parents in the faith development of children. However, intentional or not, over the last 30 to 40 years, there has been a movement away from the home being the primary place where faith is nurtured. Researcher George Barna notes, a majority of churches these days are actually guilty of perpetuating an unhealthy and unbiblical process wherein the church usurps the role of the family and creates an unfortunate, sometimes exclusive dependency upon the church for a child's spiritual nourishment. I'm going to read that last quote again because it's so significant, where Barna says, a majority of churches are actually guilty of perpetuating an unhealthy and unbiblical process wherein the church usurps the role of the family and creates an unfortunate, sometimes exclusive dependency upon the church for a child's spiritual nourishment. If you're wondering today why you may have assumed that the way you develop someone spiritually is by looking to the church and the programs and events and ministries that it can provide as the expert, it may be because churches like ours have told that to you. Which is why in this series, we want to first things first, kind of correct things around here, that here at Southridge, we don't just have a kids ministry or student ministry. We've reframed that over the last decade as a family ministry, not just to kind of give it a different twist of a name, but because it's fundamentally rooted in a different framework, where as a ministry, our primary objective is to partner with the home as the primary spiritual influence and to invest the best of our energies in partnering with and offering supports to the place of greatest influence, so that we're not usurping the role of the home or investing the best of our energies into something that has the least or a far lower influence, but actually partnering with homes to invest the best of our energies together in making the home the homegrown spiritual nurturing epicenter where God can do his greatest work. We are committed to nurturing a homegrown faith. And in this series, we're going to discover, on the one hand, how that happens and how every one of us together, no matter what season of life we find ourselves in, has a role to play. And so I would say, particularly if you're not a parent, don't tune out in this series for a couple reasons. First of all, because the idea of homegrown faith also applies to you and me, not just in other people that we develop. When Jesus invited people to follow him, he didn't just invite them to a Tuesday night Bible study, an hour or two a week. He invited people literally to come and live with him and experience him in his everyday. For every single one of us, Jesus desires to embed in a way that can express a faith that expresses itself in love through the homegrown nature of our everyday. So discovering how to have a homegrown faith applies to all of us. Secondly, like I said earlier, we all have a role to play as the spiritual family coming alongside kind of nuclear biological families to strengthen and supplement and support that homegrown faith, particularly in the next generation. For today, I just want us to understand that that's how it happens with faith development and why faith development is so distinctly different from any kind of other development where we would typically look to the experts to provide. As a pastor, I probably wish it was different. I wish I could make you more dependent on a church community and an organization like ours. But as a parent, I know that that's not the case. As parents, one of the ways that we're trying to offer development for our daughter Addie when it comes to her soccer skills is by registering her with a team that she trains with out of Western New York. And so a couple times a week, Becky or I will drive Addie over the river and take her to the Buffalo area for these soccer development sessions. Now, thankfully, our family has Nexus, and so the trip's not terribly long. But a month or so ago, I was on driving detail, and so I was driving Addie, and we came over the Peace Bridge, and we got to the border, and we scooted into the Nexus line, and we got to one or two cars from the booth, where all of a sudden the Nexus line suddenly stopped, and it continued to stop. And there was really no explanation why. We couldn't tell. It was just the gate was pushed down, and we were one or two cars from the front, and there was a line building behind us, and here we are watching the cars in the other lanes kind of pass through. We've got these Nexus cards, and we're in this Nexus line, and nothing's moving. Well, you got to know that in my time management, I don't really budget delays at the border for too long to get to soccer practice because we've got these Nexus cards. And so, after about 5 minutes, I was starting to get a little bit squirrely. And after 15 minutes of nothing happening and no communication and no insight as to what was going on, I was kind of losing my mind, and I was getting really, uncomfortable, and even yelling at the Nexus booth, and as if that's going to do anything because there's no one even in the booth at this point, and even if they were, they couldn't hear me because I'm in my car. After about 20 minutes of this, it was probably about 30 minutes in total that we waited in this stalled Nexus line. After about 20 minutes of this, I'm kind of freaking out. Addie looks over and she says to me, Dad, when you get stressed, it makes me anxious. I kind of looked over at her and she said, when you're in a hurry or you're uptight or you're frustrated, or she said, it causes me anxiety. You know that, right? And I got to say, it certainly stimulated a good conversation between Addie and I. And frankly, it passed the time in the rest of the 10 minutes while I was waiting for that stupid border to open up. So that was kind of an added bonus. But more than that, it just impressed again on my heart that in the faith formation of my kids, in the faith formation of my daughter, all of the coffees with our youth pastor and conferences she could attend and summer camp highs that she could experience, none of those are going to help embed the deep belovedness that God has for her in a way that can express itself in a faith that expresses itself in the primacy of Jesus' law of love if every day I'm sabotaging it at home. As a pastor, I wish it was different. As a parent, I know it's not. That faith formation is something that is fundamentally homegrown. So in the coming weeks, we're going to discover how that happens, how faith can get nurtured in the context of the everydays of our homes, and we're going to learn how every single one of us as part of this spiritual family can contribute to that process. For today, I just want us to be super clear what it is about faith and what it is about spiritual formation that differentiates itself from every other kind of development where we can typically look to the experts to provide it. Faith is different because it's not a doing, it's a being. It's a heart, and ultimately a heart of receiving God's love, and as it's embedded in our hearts, it's expressed back to God and others. Because faith is a being, not a doing, we can't look to the experts to provide it. We've got to own the responsibility and band together to support that spiritual development and faith formation fundamentally is homegrown. Let's pray together. Jesus, we want to thank you for the way that you want to form your life and heart in us in response to your invitation to follow you, to learn of you, to become like you. And I just pray that by your risen Spirit, you would illuminate and clarify and pour wisdom into our minds and hearts to help us to really understand how that happens in us personally, and how that happens through us in those we're responsible to develop, especially in up close and personal ways in the next generation. Jesus, I pray for these next couple weeks that we can discover how to experience a homegrown faith. And together, as a church extended family, we could discover how to contribute to each other's homegrown faith. And that you would stir up and nurture a groundswell of your Spirit by which we can all be becoming like you to a greater degree and have your love embedded in us and exuding through us to a greater degree, so that we can more effectively be following you with you, Jesus, at the center in a way that focuses most primarily on the primacy of your law of love. Thanks that your Spirit wants to do that among us. We look forward to watching you work, and we want to give you all the credit as you do. We love you, Jesus. We pray in your name. Amen.